So, after the Civil War, there was this brief moment of hope, right? This period we call Reconstruction. But that promise of freedom for Black Americans, well, it faced a devastating reversal. Today, we're going to explore how a new system of racial oppression, known as Jim Crow, was systematically built in the American South, and the huge debate it sparked among Black leaders about the best way to fight back. And the people who built this new system, they weren't exactly subtle about it. I mean, this quote from a future governor of Mississippi is just brutally frank. It makes it crystal clear that the goal, right from the very beginning, was to completely erase Black Americans from public and political life. Okay, so the first pillar of Jim Crow was all about attacking the most fundamental right of citizenship, the vote. White Southern leaders set out to, as they put it, purify the ballot box, which was really just a code word for systematically stripping Black Americans of all their political power. Now here's the thing. The architects of Jim Crow had a major roadblock, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. It says, flat out, you can't deny someone the vote because of their race. So to get around that, Southern states had to invent a whole series of supposedly colorblind tools to achieve a very racial goal without ever mentioning race. Think of it like this. They basically built a giant obstacle course for any Black citizen who wanted to vote. First up, you had the poll tax, which was a huge burden for poor Black sharecroppers. Then, they passed laws that took away your voting rights if you were convicted of even petty crimes. And finally, the literacy test. This was the real killer because local white officials had total control to decide who passed. They'd use a so-called understanding clause to let illiterate whites vote, while failing even the most educated Black citizens. So, did this system actually work? Oh, you have no idea. Just look at these numbers from Louisiana. In 1896, there were 130,000 registered Black voters. Just 4 years later, that number had plummeted to just over 5,000. It was a devastatingly effective system for what it was designed to do. But taking away the vote, that was only half the story. The second pillar of Jim Crow was the legal and social separation of the races, a system we all know as segregation. See, in the growing cities of the New South, there was this anonymity that just wasn't there in the countryside. It offered Black Americans a new kind of freedom, and that really threatened the old racial hierarchy. And segregation, that was the answer. It was a way to write white superiority into the very landscape of daily life, on trains, in schools, at restaurants, everywhere. And believe it or not, this whole system got the stamp of approval from the highest court in the land. In 1896, in the infamous case Plessy v. Ferguson, the Supreme Court created the legal lie of separate but equal. They basically argued that the Constitution couldn't force social equality if, one race was just considered socially inferior. But not everyone on the court agreed. There was one lone voice of dissent, Justice John Harlan, and his argument was powerful. He said our Constitution is colorblind, and he warned that the court's decision would, and I quote, permit the seeds of race hatred to be planted under the sanction of law. And wow, was he right. A chillingly accurate prophecy. So let's just pause for a second. The vote is gone. Public life is completely segregated by law. If you're a Black American living in this new reality, what do you do? How do you resist? This question would define a generation. And it gave rise to two towering figures with two very different answers. All right, let's start with Booker T. Washington, who was, without a doubt, one of the most powerful and influential Black leaders of his day. His strategy is often called a path of accommodation. To understand Washington, you have to understand where he came from. He was born into slavery in 1856. His entire worldview was forged in that fire. He worked his way up, got an education, and eventually founded the legendary Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. He truly believed that industrial education and practical job skills were the real keys to progress. He lays out his whole philosophy in this really famous 1895 speech that came to be known as the Atlanta Compromise. And the core idea was this: Black Americans should, for the time being, set aside their demands for things like voting rights and social equality. Instead, he argued, they should focus all their energy on building economic power through skilled labor. And this line right here, it's the most famous part of that speech. He was essentially sending a message to white America, saying, look, we can accept social segregation. We can be as separate as the fingers on a hand. But when it comes to economic progress, we need to work together as one hand. It was a pragmatic bargain, for sure, but also a deeply controversial one. Now, on the complete other side of this debate, you have the brilliant scholar and activist W.E.B. Du Bois. And he had a totally different vision. Not accommodation, but bold, direct confrontation. And you can see why if you look at his life, which could not have been more different from Washington's. Du Bois was born a free man in Massachusetts. He got an elite education at Fisk and then Harvard, where he became the first African American to ever earn a PhD. This background gave him a very, very different perspective on the fight for equality. So, as you can imagine, Du Bois completely rejected Washington's focus on vocational training. He championed an idea he called the talented 10th, the belief that the top 10% of Black intellectuals had a duty to lead the fight for immediate and full civil rights, using every tool they had: legal challenges, political organizing, and powerful scholarship. And honestly, this quote just sums it all up. For Du Bois, there was zero room for compromise on fundamental human rights. Liberty wasn't something you earned by being a good worker. It was something you demanded through what he called persistent manly agitation. So you've got these two titans, right? Two incredible leaders with two profoundly different strategies, locked in this huge debate over the future of Black America. Let's really break down where they disagreed. First off, just look at where they came from. It tells you so much. Washington knew the brutal daily reality of Southern slavery, and that shaped his cautious step-by-step approach. Du Bois, on the other hand, was born free in the North, in a world where citizenship and rights were, at least on paper, supposed to be a given. And of course, their ideas about education were worlds apart too. Washington believed practical, hands-on skills were the most realistic way for recently enslaved people to become self-sufficient. Du Bois argued that a classical, liberal arts education was essential to create the intellectual leaders who could actually challenge and dismantle white supremacy. Which brings us to the absolute heart of their disagreement, the strategy. Washington preached what you could call economic incrementalism. Get the economic power first, he said, and civil rights will eventually have to follow. Du Bois said no way. He demanded immediate political agitation, arguing that any economic gains were meaningless if they could be taken away in an instant because you had no civil rights. But here's something that's so important to remember. For all their fighting, for all their rivalry, these two men were aiming for the exact same thing: the freedom and uplift of Black Americans. They both inspired millions, and they both forced the entire nation to look in the mirror and confront its own failure to live up to its democratic ideals. And so, their great debate leaves us with this powerful, timeless question, one that still echoes today in fights for social justice everywhere. When you're facing entrenched oppression, which path truly leads to progress? Is it gradual accommodation, or is it confrontational agitation?